database, but we have no users, and we would like users. We saw on Friday that Firebase does support authentication. Perhaps we can take advantage of that, but before we worry too much about that, let's just figure out the sign-in, sign-out workflow. So right now, this is everything. We have this main component inside app that contains the sidebar, the note list, the note form. Some of those break down into further subcomponents. But none of this stuff should show if you're signed out, right? If you're signed out, you should pretty much only see a sign-in button or form or whatever. So in Dwarf Underground, part of the homework involved showing and hiding components based on some sort of condition. We didn't go over that solution, but we're going to do that same thing now, basically. So before we worry about exactly how authentication happens, we can still do that much. We can say, if you're signed in, whatever signed in means, show this stuff. If you're not, show something completely different. So app is what renders the main component. So app needs some way to determine whether we're signed in or not. So let's just make it really simple for right now and not worry too much about the details. I'm going to add a method to app called signed in. Oops, don't need that there. And for right now, I'm just going to say return true. Never mind how we're actually going to determine whether we're signed in or not. Let's just make a method there that we can check. That way we can say if signed in, then show main. And if not, then show something else, like a sign-in component. So let's make a sign-in component. In our source directory, new file, sign, capital S, capital I, in.js. Suppose we're probably going to make a style sheet for that at some point. So let's make capital S sign, capital I in dot CSS. In signin.js, we'll import React from React. I'll go ahead and import that style sheet. Not sidebar, sign in. We'll make this a stateless functional component. So it's just an arrow function. And before I forget, because otherwise I will, export default sign in. Let's make it just return something. Let's import this in app.js. Now what we want to do is show main if we're signed in, otherwise show sign out. So this might be easiest if we were to take all this main business and move it to a separate function. This isn't a terribly complicated line, but let's do that. Let's just make another method just above render called render main. And it's just going to return this JSX. Now that relies on these actions, and note data variables. So we need to move those variables up to render main out of render. Fix my indentation. Then in render, we need something conditional to happen. Basically, we're going to end up just calling this .render main in here, but only if we're signed in. So we've talked about ternary operators at some point, right? Which is just a shorthand for if-else, using a question mark. So you put your condition, in this case, this dot signed in, which will return true or false, right? Right now it's returning true. So you put your condition, followed by a question mark, and then what should happen if it's true, colon, what should happen if it's false. If it's true that we're signed in, we call this .render main. Else, colon, the sign-in component. We could have put the main JSX right here, but since it has some props, I thought this was going to become a kind of long line of code, and putting it on multiple lines might be a tad confusing.
What is that syntax called?
Ternary, T-E-R-N-A-R-Y. Lots of people want to add an extra syllable in there, but it's just ternary. And it's common in a lot of languages, tons of languages actually. Pretty much all the C-like languages and some others too. Just a one-line if-else. It's everything that used to be in render except for that outer div. So our actions variable, our note data variable, and then we return just that main JSX. Let's see what this does for us. Okay, I see no difference, right? Nothing changed. What if we change signed in to return false? Voila. Main is gone and I see sign in. Change it back to true. And main is back. So we successfully render one or the other based on whether the signed in method returns true or false. Now probably signed in is going to be based on whether there's a user, and a user will probably be stored on state. So without worrying too much about how the user gets there, because we don't know yet, whatever we do for authentication, you're going to end up with a user at the end. So we could store that on our state in app. So let's just make a place for it. We have notes on state. We have current note on state. Let's add UID for user ID. And we will start that as null. That gives us a little more flexibility to play with this flow. Right now we have signed in returning true all the time, but it could just return basically whether that UID is set. So actually, if it returned just this.state.uid, if it's null, that's false. If it's a real value, then that's going to be truthy. So now I'm signed out. If I were to play with my React Dev tools, find my app component, state is there. I have app set to $R now. If I say $R, that set state, UID, anything. Now I'm signed in. Makes sense? All we're doing is setting a UID on state, and that determines whether we show this thing or whether we show the sign-in page. We can put something on the sign-in page. Let's put a div in here with a button in it. So div with a class of capital S sign, capital I N. Inside there, put a button. That says sign in. And inside this component, we could put a method to authenticate. So we'll say const, because this is not a class. This is a function, so we need just to make a new variable for this function. I'll call it authenticate. And don't know what I want it to do yet, but I want this button to call that when it's clicked. And it's not this.authenticate because, again, it's not a class. Authenticate's just essentially a variable. So on click, we'll call authenticate. And we just want that to set the user ID on state to anything. So that's going to have to happen at app, right? Because app is where that state lives. If we want to set state on app, we have to do that in app. So add another method under signed in on app. I'll call it handle auth. This will be the thing that runs when we authenticate. And for right now, all I want to do is this set state UID equals anything other than null. I'll just put dstruce. And then I'll make sure this gets passed down to sign in. So here's sign in. Say handle auth equals this dot handle auth. So now sign in has some props. Specifically handle auth, so we'll just break that out using our destructuring trick. And then Authenticate can just call that. Make sense? What determines whether we're signed in or not is simply whether UID is set on app.js. When the page loads, it's set to null. We'll make it so that this button on sign in sets it to something. So here we are. We just have a sign in button right now. Oops. Click it, and there we go. Our notes are here. So we already have a sign out button here at the bottom. That should probably just do the opposite, right? Set it back to null. Seems easy enough. App.js, let's see. That is down in the sidebar somewhere. So first, let's just make a sign out function here. Sign out, new method. It's an arrow function using our property initializer syntax. And all we're going to do is this set state UID :null. That needs to make it to the sidebar, which goes through main, right? So we can pass this.signout as one of our actions. Sign out :this dot sign out. In main, here's the sidebar. So pass that on. Sign out equals props dot sign out. So we're again a stateless functional component, so it's not this dot props. Props are being passed in as an argument. Props dot sign out. And in the sidebar, right now we are destructuring reset current node. We need to also destructure sign out. Let's find that button. Here it is near the bottom. So button on click equals sign out. Seems legit. Let's try it out. Currently signed out. Click sign in. Here we are. Click sign out. There we are. So now we have a sign in, sign out flow. Now it just happens automatically, but there it is. I'll take it. Add authentication workflow. Basically what we've done. We don't have real authentication yet, but we do have the flow happening. We can show and hide our components based on a sort of phony signed in or signed out state. Got to start somewhere. Questions about what we've done so far? Does it make sense why this works the way it does? Yeah.
Quick question. Did you stop restructuring when you were in main?
Yeah.
Did you just set it back to pops then?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because they're too darn many of them.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, we did that on Friday. Get it? If you want to do something based on whether you're signed in or out, but you don't have an authentication system working yet, you can still do this. Somehow we're going to get a user ID. So we can just kind of fake it for now.